Colleagues, Fazila Aswat, who was with our dear and departed colleague Jo Cox when she died, is in the gallery today. Fazila, we welcome you. Order. Questions to the Prime Minister. Mr. Andrew Rosindell.
Question 1, Mr. Speaker.
Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today is the centenary of the Qualification of Women Act, when women were first allowed to stand for public office. And I'm delighted that the first woman to take her seat in the House of Commons was a Conservative. Women are coming from, Mr. Speaker, women are coming from all over the UK to the hashtag Ask Her to Stand Day, with MPs from every party extending invitations to their constituents. This will be an inspirational day that the government is delighted to support, and we hope it will encourage many more women to consider standing for political office, both locally and nationally. Mr. Speaker, it is appropriate that we are reminded of the significant contribution made to this House by female MPs, including the fine example set by the late Jo Cox. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Andrew Rosindell.
The Prime Minister will know that what drives me in politics has always been a love of country and a passionate belief in our United Kingdom. And so I have to tell the Prime Minister that I agree with the people of Romford, who are deeply unhappy by the proposed EU deal, which they believe does not represent the Brexit they voted for. Will she now, even at this late stage, please think again and instead lead our country in a new direction, completely cutting away the tentacles of the EU over our cherished island nation once and for all?
Can I say to my honourable friend, I think that people across the country who voted to leave the European Union voted to bring an end to free movement. Our deal delivers an end to free movement. They voted to bring an end to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice in the UK. Our deal delivers an end to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. They voted for us to stop sending vast annual sums of money to the European Union every year so we could spend that money on our priorities, and we will be able to do that, priorities like the National Health Service. But the European Union remains a close trading partner to the United Kingdom. As we leave the EU, we want to ensure we continue to have a good trading relationship with the European Union, and we will be able to have an independent trade policy that enables us to make decisions to trade around the rest of the world. My honourable friend is indeed a passionate champion of the United Kingdom, but he is also a passionate champion of the links that the United Kingdom has around many parts of the world, including with the Commonwealth, which can be enhanced when we leave the European Union.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank you for welcoming Fazila Aswat to Parliament today, a most welcome guest. Mr. Speaker, on the 100th anniversary of the Qualification of Women's Act, I join the Prime Minister in welcoming all women to Parliament today as part of the Ask Her to Stand campaign. We need a Parliament that truly does represent the diversity of the whole of this country. Now that a number of government ministers have confirmed this morning that leaving the EU with no deal is not an option, does the Prime Minister agree there are no circumstances under which Britain would leave with no deal?
No, I have to say to the right honourable gentleman, I have consistently made clear on this point, but the point that has been made by a number of my colleagues in relation to the vote that will come before this House on a meaningful vote on a deal from the European Union is very simple. If you look at the alternative to having that deal with the European Union, it will either be more uncertainty, more division, or it could risk no Brexit at all.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister didn't answer the question, is this the final deal or not? The Work and Pensions Secretary says this is the deal, it's been baked. Well, it's half-baked. But other members of the Cabinet want amendments to the withdrawal agreement. The Leader of the House said last week, there is, and I quote, still the potential to improve on some of the measures. That's what I'm hoping to help with. Can the Prime Minister clarify whether last week's withdrawal agreement is the final text, or is there another text that's on its way to us?
I have to say to the right honourable gentleman that he won't get any different answers from this than he's had from me previously. The package of a deal that we are negotiating with the European Union has two parts to it. There's the leaving part, which is the withdrawal agreement, and there's a future relationship, which is what is currently continuing to be negotiated with the European Union. They go together as a package. Yes, the withdrawal agreement has been agreed in principle. The whole package will be what is brought before this House, will be what is considered at the European Union Council on Sunday, and we continue to negotiate on that future relationship to get the good deal that we believe is right for the United Kingdom, a good deal that protects jobs, protects our union and protects our security.
Jeremy Corbyn!
The Prime Minister is apparently heading off to Brussels today, but the new Brexit Secretary is another non-travelling Brexit Secretary who's apparently not going with her. I wonder if the post is now. I wonder if the post is now an entirely ceremonial one. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's agreement doesn't specify how much we'd have to pay to extend the transition period. Can she confirm the choice facing the country would either be the backstop or paying whatever the EU asked us to pay to prolong that transition period?
No, the right honourable gentleman is wrong on that. The choice that would be facing, if it were the case, let's just remind ourselves what we're talking about here. We're talking about the guarantee to the people of Northern Ireland that there will be no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland. And the choice that we face, first of all, that is best ensured by getting the future relationship in place by the end of December 2020. In the event that that was not the case for a temporary period and an interim arrangement was in place, the choice the right honourable gentleman has set out is not the choice that would be before us. What we have, yes, there would be the backstop in the protocol, yes, there would be the extension of the implementation period, but what we have also negotiated in the withdrawal agreement is that alternative arrangements could be in place. The key is that they guarantee no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland.
The truth is, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's idea of taking back control of our money is to hand the EU a blank cheque, and after 2020, no rebate for the UK. Mr. Speaker, the EU's trade deal with Canada took 7 years to agree. The deal with Singapore, 8 years. The Business Secretary said this week that transition will have to be extended until the end of 2022. Outside the EU and with no leverage, does the Prime Minister think she's fooling anyone by suggesting there'll be a free trade agreement finalised by December 2020?
The future relationship that we're negotiating will set out the structure and scope of that deal that we'll be ensuring that we can negotiate in legal text once we leave the European Union. But the right honourable gentleman, I think people will have seen from his question previously to me, has shown the problem that he has with this deal. He hasn't even read it. He doesn't know what's in it. He says there's a problem with the deal and he would do it differently. He wants to renegotiate the withdrawal agreement, but as I say, he hasn't read it. He wants to oppose any deal, no matter how good it is for the UK, but he will accept any European Union deal, no matter how bad it is for the UK. And then he wants to use the implementation period that he would vote against to renegotiate the treaty that delivers the implementation period. And he said another referendum isn't an issue for today, but it could be an issue for tomorrow. He doesn't know how he'd vote, he doesn't know when it would be, he doesn't even know what the question would be. That's not leadership, that's playing party politics. I'm working in the national interest.
Mr. Speaker, it's her government that's got us into this shambles, and she knows full well, that the new European Parliament...
Order! Nobody in this chamber will be shouted down, and we've often heard it said, with high authority from the respective front benches, that that would be bad behaviour. It's happening now. Stop it, because it won't work. Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister knows full well that with a new European Parliament in place next summer and a new European Commission at the same time, the negotiations for a future trade agreement will only have less than a year to do if she's to achieve what she claims she can do. In February, the Prime Minister said that creating a customs and regulatory border down the Irish Sea is something that, and I quote, no UK Prime Minister could ever agree to. Can the Prime Minister explain why the backstop agreement would create exactly that border?
Now, I have to say, the Right Honourable Gentleman, it would not create exactly that. From February until in the last few weeks, the European Union said that the only answer was a Northern Ireland customs territory only answer in relation to the guarantee to the people of Northern Ireland. We argued and we resisted and we made clear that we would not accept the position of the European Union, and a few weeks ago they agreed with our position. They conceded to the United Kingdom so that there will not be a customs border down the Irish Sea. I think this becomes even clearer that the Right Honourable Gentleman doesn't actually know what is in the withdrawal agreement, what is in the protocol and what is in the outline political declaration. We talk about a second referendum. Never mind a second referendum. He hasn't got a first clue.
Well, with the shambles this government's got into, it's a good idea if other people are not ruling out all options. Mr. Speaker, there is an entire protocol in the withdrawal agreement setting out regulations that apply only to Northern Ireland. She clearly didn't discuss this draft agreement with the DUP because their Brexit spokesperson said, and I quote, "We are clear, we will not be voting for this humiliation." Mr. Speaker, this deal is a failure. It fails the Prime Minister's red lines, fails Labour's 6 tests, and failed to impress the new Northern Ireland Minister, who just hours before he was appointed said the deal is dead. Instead of giving confidence to the millions of people who voted both Leave and Remain, this half-baked deal fails to give any hope that can bring the country together again. Isn't it the case that Parliament will rightly reject this deal, this bad deal? And if the government can't negotiate an alternative, then they should make way for those who can and will.
The public gave us an instruction to leave the European Union, and we should all be acting to deliver that. All he wants to do is to play party politics.
Order! Mr. Kinnock, you are a cerebral denizen of the House. Gesticulation and shouting are way beneath your pay grade, man. Calm yourself and develop some sense of repose. I said the Leader of the Opposition shouldn't be shouted at. The Prime Minister should not be shouted at. Let's hear the reply. The Prime Minister.
The Right Honourable Gentleman is playing party politics. He's opposing a deal he hasn't read. He's promising a deal he can't negotiate. He's telling Leave voters one thing and Remain voters another. Whatever the Right Honourable Gentleman might do, I will act in the national interest.
Mr. Neil Parish.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, I'm a great supporter of yours and along with the British people, I accept what a difficult and tough job you have. There is much in the withdrawal agreement that I agree with, especially on food and farming, but it is not good enough as it stands. The Northern Ireland backstop threatens the integrity of the United Kingdom and weakens our negotiating position. And my farming instincts tell me I know that you do not hand over £39 billion before we get the deal. Please, can I ask you, Prime Minister, to listen to these concerns and renegotiate the deal before we put it on the floor of this House?
Can I say to my honourable friend that he's mentioned the issue of paying over money to the European Union. As I have consistently said, as I indicated, I had hoped in the first answer I gave to the Leader of the Opposition, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, and we remain negotiating on that future framework. In relation to the £39 billion, which I would remind my honourable friend is significantly less than the £100 billion the European Union were first talking about us needing to pay, these are about the legal obligations that the United Kingdom has. And I hope that every member of this House will recognise that the United Kingdom is a country that meets the legal obligations that we have.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I also welcome the anniversary of the Act that gave women the right to be represented in Parliament? Of course, it was a nationalist that was first elected to this Parliament, but we can only celebrate success when women are properly represented in this Parliament. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Prime Minister met with the First Minister of Scotland. The First Minister made it clear there are other alternatives to her government's Brexit plan. Was the Prime Minister listening?
Yep. I have to say to the right honourable gentleman, of course I heard what the First Minister said. The First Minister's alternative is for the United Kingdom to stay in the single market and stay in the customs union. And that's what we will not do.
Ian Blackford.
Mr. Speaker, this is exasperating. At least staying in the single market and the customs union has some support in this place. Mr. Speaker, when we look at the report from the UN rapporteur this week, up to a quarter of the...
Order! The Leader of the Scottish National Party will be heard. I don't think members will want to hear the question again and again and again. But let's be absolutely clear that if they shout their heads off, they'll have to hear it not once, not twice, but possibly 3 times. Mr. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the week where we hear from the UN rapporteur that up to a quarter of the people of the United Kingdom are living in poverty, something the DWP also recognises. Why doesn't the Prime Minister recognise the scale of the challenge that Brexit is only going to make worse? Why doesn't she realise that she has a responsibility to protect jobs and communities in this country? For once, start to listen. Go back to Brussels. Recognise that we all have an interest in this. Let's all work together to make sure we protect the interests of people in Scotland and elsewhere in the United Kingdom. Make sure that you go back and negotiate. Let's keep us in the single market and the customs union.
The right honourable gentleman says let's work together on this issue, but the position that he has and that his party has is one which would frustrate the vote of the British people in relation to leaving the European Union. He talks about protecting jobs. That's exactly what the deal that we're proposing does. And he talks also about listening. Well, perhaps the SNP should listen to the people of Scotland, who gave a very clear view that Scotland should remain in its most important economic market, the internal market of the United Kingdom.
Alan Mack.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 20-year-old Tommy Cowan and 18-year-old Georgia Jones, both from Havant, were sold ecstasy at a music festival and tragically lost their lives afterwards. As the inquest continues, will my right honourable friend set out the work being done to tackle the drug dealers that prey on our young people? And also join me in sending the condolences of the whole House to their families and friends?
Well, can I say to my honourable friend that I'm sure that all members from all sides of this House will want to join me in offering our deepest condolences to the families of Georgia Jones and Tommy Cowan after their tragic deaths. My honourable friend knows drugs can devastate lives, it can ruin families, they can damage communities. What our comprehensive drug strategy does is set out a balanced approach of bringing together the police, the health community and global partners to tackle the illicit drugs trade and to protect the most vulnerable in our society. And tough enforcement is a fundamental part of that. We're taking a smarter approach to restricting the supply, adapting our approach to reflect changes in criminal activity, using innovative data and technology, and taking coordinated partnership action to tackle drugs alongside other criminal activity. And of course, the role of the National Crime Agency is a key element in our dealing with the terrible aspect of drugs that can cause so much harm to people. But of course there is more that we need to do to prevent harms and to prevent tragic deaths such as those of Georgia and Tommy.
Mike Amesbury.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the past 3 weeks, I've surveyed 42 schools in my Weavervale constituency. More than £3.4 million will be taken from their budgets, and 60% of these schools have cut staff. The Prime Minister's claim that austerity is over is as credible as her Brexit plan. Will the Prime Minister get a grip or step aside?
I say to the honourable gentleman, he will know that we are putting extra money into. He'll know we're putting extra money into school funding. He will know that obviously we've changed the national funding formula to make that fairer across the country. And he will also, I would hope, welcome the fact that in the North West we now see over 895,000 children at good or outstanding schools. That's an increase of over 175,000 children since 2010. The honourable gentleman focuses on the money going into schools. He also needs to look at the outcomes from schools and the excellent work that is being done by our teachers and the children who are now in good and outstanding schools who weren't in good and outstanding schools under the last Labour government.
Robert Halfon! Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will my right honourable friend join me in welcoming Debbie Pritchard, a specialist teacher from Harlow, who's visiting us for Ask Her to Stand Day and watching from the public gallery. Does she agree with me that it's not just a question of getting more women into Parliament, but encouraging women from all walks of life, especially from disadvantaged and low-income backgrounds and working-class backgrounds as well? And does my right honourable friend support initiatives from the Conservative Foundation, the Conservative Candidate Bursary Scheme, to enable more women to access public life?
Can I say to my right honourable friend, I'm very happy to welcome his constituent Debbie Pritchard. I hope that his constituent will consider standing for Parliament. We talk about diversity in Parliament in relation to getting more women into Parliament, but my right honourable friend is also right. We need to ensure that we have people from a wide variety of backgrounds and with a wide variety of experience in this chamber, because that is the way that we get better decisions being taken in this chamber. And I'm pleased that the Conservative Party has been taking action through the bursary scheme and through the work it's doing to support disabled people getting into politics, to encouraging people with a wide range of backgrounds and with a wide range of experience to stand for Parliament and represent constituents in this chamber.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has just repeated that voting down her deal risks no Brexit at all. Does she recognise that, far from being a risk, recent polls show that actually a vast majority of people would like no Brexit at all in order to save jobs, protect the environment and ensure our standing in the world? So will she acknowledge that the will of the people can change? The will of the people has changed. And will she therefore think that the way forward is a people's vote, or does she think democracy ended on the 23rd of June 2016?
Can I say to the honourable lady that claim in relation to democracy is absolutely ridiculous. This Parliament gave people the right to choose whether to remain in the European Union or to leave the European Union. People exercised that vote. We saw numbers of people voting that we had not seen before. It was a great exercise in democracy in this country, and I believe that gave this Parliament an instruction. We should ensure that we leave the European Union as the people voted.
Robert Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I refer to my entry in the Register of Interests. There are no people more proudly and passionately British than the people of Gibraltar. Yeah. The agreed text of the withdrawal agreement gives significant and important safeguards to them in the text and in the protocol. Yeah. Will my right honourable friend make clear that under no circumstances will she permit that text to be reopened to put those safeguards at risk, and that she will under no circumstances permit Spain to seek to exclude the people of Gibraltar from discussions on the future arrangements?
Yeah. Can I say to my honourable friend that we are absolutely steadfast, as he is, in our support for Gibraltar, its people and its economy. And we've always been clear that Gibraltar is covered by our exit negotiations, and we've been committed to fully involve them as we exit the European Union. We are seeking a deal that works for the whole UK family, and that deal must work for Gibraltar too. I'm pleased that we have agreed a protocol, as my honourable friend knows, on Gibraltar, that will form part of a wider package of agreements between the UK, Spain and the Government of Gibraltar, setting out the parties' commitment to cooperation. But I've been clear, we will not exclude Gibraltar from our negotiations on the future relationship. We want a deal that works for the whole UK family, and that includes Gibraltar.
Because the government snuck out changes to the police pension scheme, Humberside Chief Constable Lee Freeman has written to MPs describing the impact as devastating. If the government doesn't change tact, it would cost the force £9.2 million. It would mean doing away with 130 police officers or all 250 PCSOs. Is the Prime Minister worried about this? Or is the Chief Constable scaremongering and just crying wolf?
Say to the honourable gentleman, he says that these pension changes were, I think the phrase he used, snuck out. This is not the case. These pension changes, this pension issue has been known of for I think it's 2 years that this has been under consideration. So it is not the case that this has been snuck out.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In all my time as a mortgage broker, when I had a remortgaging client, I never once recommended that they should stick with the standard variable rate. They'd have more freedom and they could leave the deal when they wanted without penalties, but it was bog standard and nobody ever wanted it. So given that my right honourable friend is receiving representations to ditch her deal for WTO terms, will she explain that putting aside the worst case scenario of no deal, in the very best case scenario of WTO terms, they are bog standard, average terms, far worse than the preferential tariff-free access we currently enjoy and which she has negotiated to maintain?
Yes. Can I say to my honourable friend, he's right that we want to negotiate a deal, a trading deal with the European Union that is on better terms than WTO, and there are many people across this House who want to see the United Kingdom, as we will do when we've left the EU, negotiating trade deals around the rest of the world that are on better than WTO terms. That's because we believe that is best for the United Kingdom economy, and if we're negotiating on better than WTO terms with the rest of the world, then it makes sense to be negotiating on better than WTO terms with the European Union.
The Prime Minister said school funding is up, and it is, but pupil numbers are up. Costs are up. So the Institute for Fiscal Studies says that since 2010, there's been an 8% real terms per pupil cut. How can the Prime Minister expect anybody to trust her on anything when she can't get her numbers right?
Can I say to the honourable lady, as I have said before in this chamber, overall per-pupil funding is being protected in real terms by this government. The core schools budget this year at £42 billion will be its highest ever level. We're protecting through the pupil premium this year. We're giving £2.4 billion to support those who need it most. The core schools budget is rising by nearly £2.6 billion across this year and the next. But what we have also done, alongside putting extra money into schools, is introduced a fairer national funding formula, which ensures that we see a fairer distribution of that money across the country.
Nicholas Soames.
Mr. Speaker, would my right honourable friend affirm to this House today and to the President of the Commission tonight that as we move to honour the result of the referendum, it will remain our firmest intention to retain the closest possible relationships with our European friends and allies in the very best interests of both.
Can I say to my right honourable friend that I am happy to give that commitment. I think it is important for us to recognise that while we're leaving the European Union, we're not leaving Europe. We do want to continue to have a good, not just a good trading relationship and a close trading partnership with the European Union, but actually we want to continue to have that close security and defence partnership that we have had with the European Union and other countries across Europe as well. This is what makes sense, as my right honourable friend says, not just for the UK, but for all those European Union member states as well.
Mr. Gavin Shuker.
Mr. Speaker, since her modern slavery bill passed, the Republic of Ireland, Northern Ireland and France have joined Norway, Sweden and Iceland in passing a sex bylaw. That makes us an even more lucrative market for sex traffickers, because we're now effectively surrounded by states which tackle the demand that drives commercial sexual exploitation. In responding to the independent review of her legislation, 5 years on, will she now commit to look seriously at sex bylaw?
Can I say to the honourable gentleman, he raises a very important issue, obviously, and having introduced the Modern Slavery Act, I'm pleased to say that between 2015 and 2017, we've seen a 52% increase in modern slavery offences prosecuted. There's more for us to do, but we should welcome the change that has already taken place. But he asked specifically about the sex bylaw. Separate to the review of the Modern Slavery Act, the Home Office has provided funds for research into the nature and prevalence of sex work in England and Wales, and that follows a report by the Home Affairs Select Committee on Prostitution. And as I'm sure the honourable gentleman will appreciate, we believe that an evidence base is vital before considering any changes in this area. The research that's taking place will be completed next spring.
Esther McVeigh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Prime Minister assure the House today, as she has done on many other occasions, that the UK will be leaving the EU on the 29th of March 2019, come what may?
Yes, can I first of all thank my right honourable friend for the work that she did as Secretary of State for Work and Pensions. And indeed work that she had done as a minister previously, because the Disability Confidence Scheme particularly has had an impact, which she championed and continues to champion, has had an impact on the lives of working people who are disabled. And I can give her the assurance that the United Kingdom will leave the European Union on the 29th of March 2019.
Colleen Fletcher.
Last Friday, during Parliament Week, I visited St Elizabeth's School in my constituency to meet with the school's council. The children told me that rising crime levels and falling police officer numbers have made them fearful of using and enjoying their local park, the one near their school. Can the Prime Minister tell the school council, and they may be listening today, what strategy the government is deploying to ensure that all young people feel and are safe from crime on our streets and in our public spaces?
The honourable lady raises an important point. We want young people to be able to feel secure if they're walking through the streets or if they're in a park and gathering with their friends. What we need to do in looking at the concern that has been expressed about crime, and particularly I recognise the concern that's been expressed about knife crime and levels of knife crime, is actually tackle this in a number of different ways across the board. It's about ensuring we have the right powers for the police, it's about ensuring that we have the right system in the criminal justice system, but it is also about providing education for young people about the risks of carrying knives. It is also about providing alternatives to those young people who are tempted to join gangs, because a lot of the crime that we see is related to gang activity. So this is something that has to be addressed across the board, but I recognise the importance of doing that to ensure that young people have the security and safety and confidence that they need.
George Freeman.
Speaker, unlike the Leader of the Opposition, I and colleagues have read the draft withdrawal agreement and the many briefings, and it's clear to me that the Prime Minister and her Cabinet have laudably tried to reconcile the demand for continuity of market access today with freedom to diverge tomorrow. Isn't the truth of the backstop as drafted that if and as we were to exercise our regulatory freedom, whether in agri-food or in data protection, we would harden allow the EU to harden the border between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Can the Prime Minister reassure me and seek reassurance in Brussels today that this draft doesn't contain a trap, that if we dare to diverge, we undermine our union?
I say to my honourable friend, first of all, as he will know, there are a number of ways, as I set out earlier, if it is the case that it is necessary to have an interim arrangement to provide this guarantee in relation to the border of Northern Ireland. There are a number of ways in which that can be achieved. The backstop as identified in the protocol, the extension of the implementation period, or alternative arrangements. And work is being done on those. What I also say to my honourable friend is that the backstop is intended to be a temporary arrangement, and for that limited period of time, if he just casts his mind to a sort of practical thought about what could happen, if we were in the situation where the backstop had to be in place for a matter of months, for example, I think that it would be right for this United Kingdom to give this commitment that we would not be looking to diverge during that period from regulations during that period, that we would ensure that we kept that free access for the goods from Northern Ireland to coming into Great Britain, as we have committed in the withdrawal agreement, in the text that is set out, and we had committed previously. That will be, of course, a decision for us here, but what is important is that we have a means of ensuring that the backstop remains temporary. The best means of doing that is what we're in at the moment, negotiating the future relationship, which will ensure that the backstop does, if it is ever used, remain temporary, and preferably is never used at all.
Marion Fellows.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The United Nations has recently joined with other radical organisations like the National Audit Office in condemning the government's failure to address the tragedy, which is poverty. Which of the fundamental failures
the de facto ruler of the UAE, who has organised many of the excellent visits from this House to the UAE, but this is wholly inconsistent with the behaviour of a nation with whom we have a mutual defence accord. And will the Prime Minister please give this her urgent attention? And if he's not released, I don't see why we should be committed to their defence.
I say to my honourable friend, we are, of course, as he is, deeply disappointed and concerned at today's verdict, and I realise how difficult and distressing this is, both for Matthew Hedges but also for his family. We are raising it with the Emirati authorities at the highest level. My right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, is urgently seeking a call with the Foreign Minister Abdullah bin Zayed. During his visit to the UAE on November the 12th, he raised the issue with both Crown Prince Mohammed bin Zayed and the Foreign Minister, and I can assure my honourable friend and other members that the Foreign Office will remain in close contact with Matthew, his family and his lawyer. We will continue to do all we can to support them as they consider the next steps, and we will continue to press this matter at the highest level with the Emiratis.
Angela Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister's having a rough old time of it at the moment, but I'm sure she recognises that there are issues other than Brexit that we need to be dealing with. On that basis, can I ask the Prime Minister, on behalf of my constituent Claire Throssell, whether we are going to get the promised domestic violence bill on the statute book before the end of the parliamentary session?
Can I first of all send my deepest condolences to Claire Throssell and the Honourable Lady's constituent, and I'd like to pay tribute for the fantastic work that she does as an ambassador for Women's Aid. We are committed to transforming the response to domestic violence. The consultation that took place in the spring received over 3,200 responses. I think that shows the degree of concern that people have about this issue of domestic violence and the recognition of the need to look carefully at the legislation on this. I understand the Home Office will be publishing a response to the consultation together with the draft domestic abuse bill later this session.
Miller.
All of the evidence shows that diversity delivers better decision-making, yet over the last 100 years in this place, 4,503 men have been elected and just 491 women. Now, I'm proud that 2 of those Conservative women became Prime Minister. But can my right honourable friend share with me what she feels that Parliament, as well as the political parties, could be doing to help encourage more of the women who are with us here today as part of the Ask Her to Stand campaign actually do go forward and stand for election and join us on these green benches?
Can I say to my right honourable friend that I thank her for championing this cause. I think this is so important. She's absolutely right that greater diversity in this place actually means that we get better decisions. That's the same for Parliament as it is for a business or indeed any organisation. Can I also say to my right honourable friend that I think we should send a very, very clear message from everybody across this House about the significance of the work that an individual Member of Parliament does and the change they can make for their community. I think this is one of the best, being a Member of Parliament is one of the best jobs in the world. It gives an opportunity to make a real difference to the lives of people. It's an opportunity to be a real voice for those whose voice otherwise would not be heard. And it is a real opportunity to take decisions that will lead our country forward and provide a better future for people's children and grandchildren. It's a great job, and I encourage all the women who are here today and thinking of standing to stand for Parliament, get elected and make a difference.
Mr. Nigel Dodds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the December joint report agreed between the European Union and the United Kingdom, it was agreed that Northern Ireland would have the final say on whether or not it diverged from the UK single market and was subjected to single market European rules with no say. Why has the Prime Minister deleted all reference to that in the withdrawal agreement? Did she push the delete button?
The right honourable, can I say to the right honourable gentleman, of course he's absolutely right about the December joint report. The issue of what the process is would be within the United Kingdom to look at this issue of regulations is a matter that will be a matter for this United Kingdom to determine both our parliamentary rules, our parliamentary decisions on that, and indeed the Stormont lock that was expressed in the December joint report. Of course, as the right honourable gentleman will always also know, the lock that was in the December joint report referred to a decision being taken by the Northern Ireland Executive and Northern Ireland Assembly, which sadly we do not have in place today.
Heidi Allen.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. On Monday of this week, I heard something I never want to hear again. A young woman in her 30s actively researching funeral plans because she knows she has cystic fibrosis and there is no cure. It was an event organised by my honourable friend for Dudley North for cystic fibrosis sufferers. And this is about the conversation that NICE, NHS England and Vertex, reaching this impasse for almost 3 years now to access Orkambi to patients who need it. Pharmaceuticals, of course, are entitled to make profit. R&D is expensive and it's lengthy. But when it comes to our Health Select Committee having to ask for transparency on the finances to try and break the impasse here, we have to do something differently. Looking at the huge global forward profits for Vertex, I would ask the Prime Minister, would she personally work with the Secretary of State for Health to break this impasse and get Vertex to those patients who are desperate to relieve their symptoms from cystic fibrosis?
Well said. Can I say to the my honourable friend that she has raised what I know has been an important question. It's been raised in this House before, and I recognise the concern about the length of time that this issue is being worked on. The Department for Health and Social Care is working with both NICE and the NHS. They've made the single biggest drug offer, I believe, in the NHS's history to Vortex, the pharma company, and Vortex need to work with NICE to get this approved. But I will ensure that the concern that she has, that has been expressed, and I know exists in relation to this matter, is fully made clear to the Department of Health and Social Care in the work that they're doing with NICE, the NHS and the pharma company to ensure that the result is one which is of benefit to those patients who are looking desperately for this drug.
Okay. Sir Vincent Cable.
Article 171 of the withdrawal agreement says that in the event of deadlock in the arbitration panel on a dispute on the any aspect of the treaty, the chair, who has the decisive vote, will be chosen by lots. Now, I know the government is close to the gambling industry, but isn't it rather reckless to leave crucial decisions of national importance under the withdrawal agreement to the toss of a coin?
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman that we have put in place arbitration arrangements which mirror arbitration arrangements which exist in other international treaties, and he will also be aware that it does also say in the withdrawal agreement that in identifying individuals who would be capable of sitting on that arbitration panel, the names, I think the number is given, is 5 individuals will be identified as those who will be suitable to be chairman of the panel.
Thank you. Order. Yes. I will hear the honourable gentleman when the House has composed itself. In the frankly extraordinary circumstance that there are honourable and right honourable members who do not wish to hear the honourable gentleman's point of order, I think it's seemly to wait until their speedy and quiet exit has taken place and the rest of us can listen to the mellifluous tones of the honourable gentleman. Point of order, Mr. Chris Elmore.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I seek your advice on a recent report from the Procedure Committee regarding speaking limits on speeches in the Chamber and an older report on the review of standing orders of the House. I was concerned to see that various standing orders make reference to the influence of the Chair to control proceedings and, of course, the conduct of members. Oddly and archaically, in my view, standing orders make only reference to members being male. As an example, page 43 of Standing Orders, number 42 and 42A, irrelevance and repetition, something I know members of the House never take part in, Mr. Speaker, and I quote, "The Speaker or Chair, after having called to the attention of the House or of the committee to conduct of a member persists in irrelevance or tedious repetition is either in his own arguments used by other members or in debate may direct him to discontinue his speech." And, Mr. Speaker, the Speaker or the Chair may direct any member who breaches the terms of sub judice resolution of the House to resume his seat. On further inquiry, there are numerous standing orders that make reference to him or his in relation to members of the House, and no standing order I've read makes reference to women holding seats in the House. In the Procedure Committee report on revisions of standing orders 3 years ago, a recommendation was made for amendments, and I quote, "for gender-neutral language such as he or she for he, when the pronoun does not refer to a holder of a specific office, or drafting to avoid the need to use a gendered pronoun." My understanding is the recommendation has never been implemented, despite being several years old. Mr. Speaker, with all sincerity, I'm sure you would agree that if we are to be a truly progressive Parliament, especially on the day that 100 years ago, as made reference by the Prime Minister and my honourable friend Leader of the Opposition, women were rightly allowed to stand for Parliament, and in the year of universal suffrage, something as basic as our standing orders should reflect that women are allowed to serve and sit in this House.
I thank the honourable member for giving me notice that he wished to raise this matter as a point of order. Moreover, I think it fair to say, and I doubt anybody will demur as I do so, that no one could accuse the honourable gentleman of excluding from his point of order any matter which he thought might in any way, at any time, to any degree, be judged to be material. I have no comment to make on the honourable gentleman's observations about the Procedure Committee deliberations on time limits. Moreover, what the honourable gentleman said on other matters, for example, tedious repetition, was unexceptionable, and there is no need for me to add to it. However, on the main point that I think the honourable gentleman wished to register with the House, let me say to him that I share his concern fully about this matter. Many honourable and right honourable members and observers outside the House will agree with the honourable gentleman that it is frankly archaic that our standing orders use gendered pronouns. It is deeply unsatisfactory that the revisions to the standing orders proposed by the clerk and recommended by the Procedure Committee in March 2015 have still not been brought to the House for decision. I would very much like to expedite these changes, but as the honourable gentleman will know, this does not lie in my hands. I would encourage the honourable member to pursue the matter with the Leader of the House at business questions, and perhaps also to urge his colleagues on the opposition front bench to press through the usual channels for action. Meanwhile, I hope that his concern, which I have reiterated I share, has been noted on the Treasury bench. If the honourable gentleman feels the House needs to hear him at this time, well, point of order, Mr. Raymond Chishti.
Mr. Speaker, 125 members of Parliament from across the House, including Lord Spiritual, have written to the Prime Minister asking the government to do the right thing in the Asher BB case, where somebody's life is in grave danger and they're being persecuted for their faith. My question to you, Mr. Speaker, is this: how long should those members of Parliament have to wait to hear from the Prime Minister in a case of such importance, where we, the United Kingdom, should offer asylum and act quickly because somebody's life is in grave danger?
Grateful to the honourable gentleman for his point of order. What the honourable gentleman didn't say was when he wrote, in my experience, the Prime Minister is as courteous as anybody in this House. She receives a very large volume of correspondence, as other very senior members do, and it's her usual practice to respond timorously. But I don't know when the letter was written. All I would say is that the matter clearly is of the highest importance, and I hope that by the ruse of a point of order, the honourable gentleman has effectively expedited the matter. If he has not succeeded in doing so, I've got a feeling that we will be hearing from him again ere long. And I thank the honourable gentleman. It was indeed an important matter, and I appreciate him raising it. If there are no further points of order, the appetite has now been satisfied. We come to the urgent question. Emily Thornberry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask the Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs to make a statement on the UK's effort to secure a new UN Security Council resolution on Yemen?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for raising this vital issue. The conflict in Yemen has escalated to become one of the worst humanitarian disasters in the world. Today, 8 million people, nearly a third of the population, depend on United Nations food aid. Starvation and disease have taken hold across the country. More than 420,000 children have been treated for malnutrition, and 1.2 million people have suffered from a cholera epidemic. In total, about 22 million people across Yemen, nearly 80% of the population, are in need of help. Yet the bare statistics cannot convey the enormity of this tragedy. What we're witnessing is a man-made humanitarian catastrophe inflicted by a conflict that has raged for too long. Britain is one of the biggest donors of emergency aid, providing £170 million of help to Yemen this year, bringing our total support to £570 million since 2015. But the only solution is for all the parties to set aside their arms, cease missile and air attacks on populated areas, and pursue a peaceful political settlement. Last week I conveyed this message to the leaders of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, who lead the coalition fighting to restore Yemen's legitimate government, when I visited both countries. On Monday, I visited the same in Tehran. I said the same in Tehran to the Foreign Minister of Iran, which backs the Houthi rebels. On the same day, I instructed our mission at the United Nations to circulate a draft resolution to the Security Council urging a durable cessation of hostilities throughout Hodeidah province and calling on the parties to cease all attacks on densely populated civilian areas across Yemen. This draft resolution also requires the unhindered flow of food and medicine and all other forms of aid across the country. The aim of this UK-sponsored resolution is to relieve the immediate humanitarian crisis and maximise the chances of achieving a political settlement. Martin Griffiths, the UN envoy, is planning to gather all the parties for peace talks in Sweden in the next few weeks. Amid this tragedy, the House will have noticed some encouraging signs. Last week, Saudi Arabia and the UAE paused their operation in Hodeidah, although there was a further outbreak of fighting yesterday. The Houthi rebels have publicly promised to cease their missile attacks on Saudi Arabia. Martin Griffiths is meeting all parties as he prepares the ground for the talks in Sweden. Britain holds a unique position as the penholder for Yemen in the Security Council, a leading humanitarian donor, and a country with significant influence in the region. So we will make every effort and use all the diplomatic assets at our command to support the UN envoy as he seeks to resolve a crisis that has inflicted such terrible suffering.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for granting this urgent question, because it is only right that all of us from across the House that have been urging the government for more than 2 years now to table a ceasefire resolution in Yemen should have the chance to discuss the draft that will finally go before the UN tomorrow. But can I applaud the Foreign Secretary for the fresh impetus that he has brought to that process, just as he has in recent days to the case of Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe? Because, yes, there have been other factors at play: the appalling bus bombings in August, the famine faced by 14 million Yemeni citizens, the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, the rising tide of public anger at the war, and the news today that at least 85,000 children have died of hunger and disease since the war began. But unlike his predecessor, this Foreign Secretary has not buried his head in the sand. He has listened to this House, and he deserves credit for that. And even if we have had to wait for a long time, and we have, there is a great deal to welcome in this draft resolution. We all support its key demands: an immediate cessation of hostilities around Hodeidah, urgent and unhindered access for humanitarian relief, all targeting of civilians to stop, compliance by all sides with international humanitarian law, and full cooperation with the UN's peace envoy. I will write to the Foreign Secretary later with a number of detailed questions on this resolution, and I will ensure that that letter is available to colleagues. But in the brief time that I have, may I ask him 3 questions? Firstly, the 5 key demands that I've mentioned were all included in the government's draft resolution circulated in October 2016, which frankly gives the lie to every excuse that the House was ever offered about why this draft was dropped. So can the Foreign Secretary give us his explanation for why we have had 2 years of inaction, and tell us what has changed and why it has taken so long? Second, and this was also a failing of the 2016 draft, can the Foreign Secretary tell us why this latest resolution fails to spell out what compliance with the resolution will be monitored and by whom, and what sanctions will apply to any party who breaches its terms, whether in terms of the ceasefire or the restriction of humanitarian aid? And finally, there is one major change between this resolution and the draft in 2016, and this is my most important point, Mr. Speaker. While this resolution talks about violations of international law in Yemen, it proposes no investigation of those crimes, let alone the independent and transparent investigations that we need for all of those who are responsible to be held to account. So, can I ask the Foreign Secretary to explain that admission? And can I ask him a simple yes or no question? Was a demand for an independent, transparent investigation into all alleged war crimes in Yemen and full accountability for those responsible, which is not included in the current draft, included in the draft that he showed to the Crown Prince bin Salman when they met last week in Riyadh?
Well, first of all, can I thank her for the tone of her comments, because she is absolutely right that this is a humanitarian catastrophe, and what matters in this situation is finding a way forward. And so I will try hard to answer her questions. First of all, the important thing about the resolution that we're proposing is not that this is the end of the story in terms of international efforts to broker a ceasefire. This is a step in the road. We want a ceasefire. We want a ceasefire that will hold. And we know that the risk, if you go for too much too early in these resolutions, is that they end up getting ignored. And so this is a carefully brokered form of words designed to get a consensus from both sides that allow talks to start before the end of this month in Stockholm. That's the objective of this resolution. If the talks are successful, we will be able to have a much stronger resolution that follows those talks that will indeed, she talks about compliance from a sedentary position, absolutely, and I'm going to come on to the investigation issue as well. But it's very, very important at this stage that we have a resolution that first of all passes and secondly puts in place things that build confidence on both sides. Now, she asked me why the original draft was not pursued, and the reason that it was not pursued was because, unfortunately, and she's been following this issue closely for longer than I have, but my assessment was, when I arrived in this post, that tragically both sides have believed over that period, both sides, that a military solution is possible. And that is why there has been an unwillingness at huge cost to the people of Yemen. And I just want to tell her, she told me about the Save the Children report today, which I agree is horrific. I found out last week that in the last week for which we have data, 14,000 people caught cholera in Yemen. So this is a situation that is escalating out of control. So the immediate priority in this resolution is to allow the flow of humanitarian aid, but secondly, a cessation of hostilities that will allow the trust to be built up. And thirdly, we need the confidence-building measures, which involves allowing, for example, the payment of salaries of civil servants in Yemen, getting foreign currency into the economy. So, in terms of compliance, what will happen when this resolution goes through, as I hope it will, is that the UN will monitor compliance, and if there is not compliance, well, I'm just answering her question. She's asked what will happen about compliance, and I've said the UN will monitor compliance, and if there is not compliance, then it is up to the UN to decide what further measures are taken. But I would point out to her that we're talking about a very short time period, because what we're trying to do is to get the participants to Stockholm on around the 28th of November. That's the purpose of doing this. And if we can get people talking and we can build the trust, and the one piece of optimism in this incredibly tragic story is the fact that the outline of a political settlement is actually fairly clear, and there is a broad degree of agreement on all sides. So it's really about building the trust to get there. Now, in terms of the investigation of war crimes, I absolutely agree with her. There has to be a full investigation, there has to be full accountability. And all these things will happen in the context of a political settlement that stops the fighting, stops people starving, allows people to get the vital medicines that they need. And in that context, I went to Saudi Arabia, I went to the UAE, and I went to Iran, and in all cases I had tough messages for the people that I was speaking to about the fact that this situation has to change. And that is what I am doing. And that does mean, yes, that does mean compromises on all sides in order to get agreement. And that is what we are doing, and that is the role of this country, because we have to be careful that we shouldn't overestimate our influence, but we shouldn't underestimate it either. And we have a vital role to pursue peace, and that is what we're going to do.
Tom Tugendhat. Speaker, may I first of all welcome my right honourable friend's efforts in the region, most notably in Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates and, of course, in Iran recently. What we're watching is the degradation and destruction of a wonderful country and a huge humanitarian tragedy occurring. Can I praise, please, the work of our UN staff, and particularly the Permanent Representative Karen Pierce, in what she has done to bring this resolution forward? And can I urge him to double his efforts, though it seems hard to imagine that he could, but if he could double his efforts to try and get the talks to Stockholm and try and end this tragedy and persuade particularly our friends that they are making a very serious mistake.
Well, my honourable friend speaks very wisely, and Karen Pierce has done a fantastic job in the United Nations, as have our ambassadors on the ground. And he is right. The immediate priority is to get these talks to start, because we had a full start with the talks we were hoping to happen in Geneva in August. And there are signs now, I think, that both sides are more willing to talk and engage in these discussions. And I think the message could not be clearer to the participants on all sides. He's absolutely right. Our allies, the Saudis and Emiratis, have had to receive hard messages from us in the last few days, but it's also the case that the Houthis have had to receive tough messages too, and that was why I went to Iran this week, because this is an opportunity we must not miss.
Sir Stephen Geffins.
Speaker, and Mr. Speaker, can I thank the Foreign Secretary for his recognition of the humanitarian cost and the tone that he brings to this. And the Save the Children report reported that 85,000 children under 5 had starved to death as a direct result of the war in Yemen, with half the population being at risk of famine. And can I associate myself with the remarks of the Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee in terms of the work of UK officials, not least the Ambassador at the UN. However, the Foreign Secretary talked about UK aid, and he's right, and we recognise the importance of that. But UK arms sales to Saudi Arabia far outstrips our aid. And in fact, last year, 2017, there was an increase on 2016 in the levels of arms sales that were being sold to Saudi Arabia. As there's recognition across the House, this conflict is having an appalling humanitarian cost, and there's been an agreement for quite some time that there is no military solution to this conflict. As such, is it not time to turn off the taps of arms sales to Saudi Arabia right now?
Well, I completely understand why he asks that question. But can I gently say to him that if we did as he is proposing, he needs to ask how that would help the people who are starving today in the Yemen, because their situation is absolutely desperate. But far from helping them, there would have been no visit by the UK Foreign Secretary to Saudi Arabia last week, no opportunity to have a frank and sometimes difficult conversation with the Crown Prince, no trip to Tehran, because their reason for talking to us is because we have a relationship with the Saudis. There would have been no support across the table for a Security Council revolution. So British influence, far from being able to bring both sides together, would reduce to zero. And that is why the right thing for us to do with respect to arms sales is to follow the incredibly strict arms control regime introduced by a Labour government in 2000, one of the strictest in the world, which does have objective measures to make sure that we don't export arms to places where there's a high risk of violations of international humanitarian law.
Andrew Mitchell.
Mr. Speaker, I have to say that the welcome and urgently needed change of policy, which people across this House have been calling for more than 2 years now on Yemen, is greatly to be welcomed and coincides with the arrival of the new Foreign Secretary at the Foreign Office. Does he understand that the condemnation of violence and the horrendous suffering in Yemen must be even-handed if Martin Griffiths and his colleagues are to succeed in negotiating a cessation of warfare and meaningful talks? And I say to the Foreign Secretary with the deepest possible sadness that it comes to something when Britain lags behind the moral curve set by the Trump White House.
Well, I welcome his comment and I also welcome his expertise, but I don't agree with his last comment at all. The UK has actually been in the forefront of trying to broker a solution, and he is absolutely right that there will only be a solution to this if there is an even-handed approach to the problems, which is exactly what Martin Griffiths is doing, and that's why we're supporting his work and listening very carefully, at every stage of what we do, listening very carefully to what he says, because he has dialogue with the Saudis and Emirati, but he also has dialogue with the Houthis. And the difficulty in terms of the historical situation is that we all have to remember that this really started on the 21st of September 2014, when the Houthis, who represent less than 25% of the population of the Yemen, ejected the legitimate government of the Yemen. And that has been the start of this conflict. We now need to get all sides together, of course listen to all legitimate concerns, but we do have to remember the historical context.
Yeah. Mr. Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. The House appreciates the efforts which the Foreign Secretary is making in this matter, but can I put this question to him? He referred to the Houthis' announcement that they would cease missile and drone attacks on Saudi Arabia, but it's not entirely clear that Saudi Arabia has yet given up the idea that it might achieve a military victory, and it is reported that they reacted very badly to the draft resolution that the government has put forward. So I want to come to the question of the 2-week deadline for the lifting of all barriers to aid coming through Hodeidah. The truth about the Yemen conflict is that in the past deadlines have come and deadlines have gone and people have died. And the question I want to ask the Foreign Secretary, he said it would be a matter for the UN Security Council, is what kind of consequence does he think it would be right for us as a world to make clear to the Saudis and the Houthis will follow if they fail now to accept what we hope will be a United Nations resolution telling them in 2 weeks it's got to stop?
Well, my right honourable friend has enormous experience, and I think he speaks with enormous wisdom. So the first point I would say about what he says is that it is because of those deadlines that have come and gone and pledges that have been broken over the tragic 3 years of this conflict that we are being very careful in the wording that we put forward now to try to get a wording that could stick and that could have the support of all sides. He is absolutely right that there will be very serious consequences if we don't put a solution, if we don't see progress. He will understand if I don't spell out to the House what those consequences are. But all I can say is that I don't believe that our allies are in any doubt of the extremely high priority that both we attach to this and the Americans attach to this as well. And I think that is very, very significant.
Priti Patel.
I want to thank the Foreign Secretary for coming here today and providing such clarity, not just in terms of the situation, but actually the United Kingdom's government's commitment and focus in coming to the right kind of outcomes when it comes to building trust and confidence. Can he say more, though? We are a great humanitarian leader when it comes to the Yemen crisis. People are dying every day and have been for many years now. How are we mobilising other allies to provide support in the wider context, but also to absolutely break the gridlock now on humanitarian aid and assistance?
Well, I thank her for her contribution, and of course I would expect her to speak with great knowledge about the humanitarian side of this, given her former